will be Mary Cornish, who's a senior partner in the Cavalluzzo law firm, probably the leading labor law firm in the province, if not the country. And Mary was absolutely key, as we say in the propaganda calling this meeting together, the link and buckle with the labor movement and the feminist movement in winning the enormously important victories around equal pay and workplace rights. She continues to chair the Equal Pay Coalition and continues to lobby and lead the struggle in Ontario for pay equity in Ontario.
Thank you. So I noticed that in the room there are many people who are very active in this struggle, which it was an important one, and I just wanted to recognize that, I think as you have as well, that there are many people involved. But I'd like to take you back to, from the point of view of the particular struggle, and one of the people actually who also, Laurel Ritchie, who's here, who helped co-found the Equal Pay Coalition in Ontario. But one of the other people who was very instrumental in Ontario was Madeline Perrant.
Yes.
And, get emotional when she talk about Madeline. So Madeline, back in the early 70s, was very active in terms of the equal pay for work of equal value issue. And in fact, Madeline, it was interesting when I was trying to recall back about this, she was very firm on the notion that there was an international right which women were entitled to, which was the ILO Convention, which actually started back in the 50s and was one of the first conventions internationally that actually had a systemic focus for women. In other words, it actually didn't have because it was about equal value and recognized women were in job ghettos and did different work, it actually kind of recognized the unequal circumstances that women were in, which were back in the 50s was quite an unusual thing to do. So she was very interested in and saw it as very important, this focus on a right. And so that's one of the themes actually that's carried through even to our campaigns today, is that it is a human right that needs to be redressed. We started off, as I say, back, Madeline was, and Laurel were actually also involved in campaigns around the cleaners and the amendment of the Employment Standards Act back in, I think, 1974 to allow equal pay for substantially the same work. You'll recall situations about orderlies and aides, cleaners who did, if you had the big machine as your cleaner, you got paid more than if you were the women and didn't have the big machine but did other things. And so these were some of the struggles that were going on at the time that led to an original focus on equal pay. I was a young law student at that point, and I had an interest both in labor work and also in feminism. And so the long and short of it is that as we were talking, and various other women were involved in the labor movement, which is the connection I think that we've talked about before. And not all of them were in high positions within the labor movement. And so at various points, one of the dynamics of this is that the people who were in the coalition, actually as time went by, they rose in power within a variety of their organizations. But they weren't always that at the beginning, and sometimes it required, depending on some more powerful men, for example, Cliff Pilkey during the 70s, who was actually very committed to it within the Federation of Labor. So ultimately, the Equal Pay Coalition was one of the first organizations, along with in the reproductive area, but certainly for the Ontario Federation of Labor, who became a member of it. I remember at the time them saying, well, they didn't really become members of things, right? In other words, people became, they talked to people, but people didn't, they didn't join stuff, right? And I said, well, I need you to join, actually. And we also had the business of professional women's groups in it as well, which was another thing that was quite different, right? And people would go, so we would have the Ontario Federation of Labor, we would have the people from the various union groups, we would have the business of professional women's representative. We had the YWCA. So we had a coalition of community groups allied with labor groups, which really was one of, as Leo has talked about, one of the keys to the success of the group. Now it also led to a variety of tensions, particularly as we got closer to having a law, as to what exactly would be in the law when you have such a diverse group to have discussions with, right? But it's partly how we got the law. And the other aspect of it was, and I always was very amazed that you could have these huge demonstrations, because I was always afraid somebody might require us to have one. And it would be revealed that we were, like a house of cards that would come down as we couldn't really show that we would get everybody out on the streets, so we tried to kind of threaten but not do it. So you were much better at actually getting them all out on the streets. But as we went along, we would keep successively trying to get various ministers of labor to do something through the 70s and 80s, and they would say no, they didn't really want to do it. Although interestingly, one of their first tactics was to say that they weren't going to give us equal pay for work of equal value, which had then been ratified by Canada in 1972. So there was some basis upon which they really should have done something. But they said, no, they were going to give us affirmative action, but it would be voluntary. And that was more important than equal pay. And so we would say, well, we would actually like that too. But we think that you should pay the vast majority of women who are in their jobs more for their jobs, other than saying that we're going to have a wholesale redistribution of everybody into a different job, which was really their argument. And of course, they were only going to move a few people out because it tended to be, focused on we were going to have some more women move into professional jobs and this would work out, right? We're saying, no. There are all these women in these jobs. They should be paid more, and we'll also discuss moving people into other jobs. So they weren't really that interested in that. And however, there was we went and met with both the NDP and the Liberals. Now this was also something new for the Federation of Labour, who never went and met with the Liberals, right, because they relied to the NDP. And so I said, no, you have to come because we're nonpartisan, right? In other words, we are not directly affiliated to a particular party. We have an issue and we're going to pursue whoever will align that issue. And in fact, we got the Liberals to agree that they would be in favor of an equal pay for work of equal value law. So, and that again is that lobbying, which with both the NDP and the Liberals agreeing to it, was really the only way we got the act, because when all of a sudden the Tories were defeated, which was a little surprising at the time, all of a sudden the NDP and the Liberals had to decide what was going to be in the Accord. And the only two, not the only, but one of the things that was in the Accord on both parts was equal pay for work of equal value. So really that was how, and it also had Ian Scott, who was at the time the Attorney General, so it went into the Accord, and once it was in the Accord, they then issued a green paper which said they weren't going to discuss whether they were doing it, they were only going to discuss how they were doing it. However, I just thought, Lynn Spink, who actually drafted this back in 1985, just to give you an idea of the flavor of this then, Barbara Meal, do you recall? August 5th, 1985. Of all the concepts that the totalitarian instinct of our times has bequeathed to society, the seemingly harmless slogan, equal pay for work of equal value, is potentially the most destructive to a free society. To stop this steamroller policy will require fighting short-sighted and narrow-minded feminists, as well as cowardly and opportunistic politicians. Laura Savia, pay equity will assure them of a total dependency on the state. It's the socialist way. Heaven help Ontario. The Globe and Mail, respond with care to preserve the genius of the market. Friends of the market should feel no qualms in defending its historic gift. That's July 10th, 85. Supply and demand is not mentioned, an unacceptable dismissal of market forces. And let me see some more. the Globe and Mail, November 85, the pernicious self-selection of women for lower paying jobs is not confronted. Because they just choose them.
That's right.
Anyways, so that gives you an idea of the flavor back in 85. And this was once actually, it was interesting how in a way the issue got out of hand, because it got in the Accord before anybody really could quite figure out what had happened. And then the forces started moving to try and figure out what to do about that. And of course, you know, there was a lot of movement by business to try and defeat it. And the alliances that, one of the things that we had tried to do was to have, as we say, as many people as possible on our side so they couldn't use other people to do it. Now one of the, one of the issues is as you go along, and I'll talk a bit later about as we expanded the way we looked at the pay gap, but at the time, when we ended up getting the law, and interestingly it came into effect in January of 88, which was it was quite a year. As we proceeded after that, one of the issues, and also I want to address one of the other things that came up at the time, was this whole thing of whether or not you just depend on laws, right? And some of the criticisms were, it's too legal, it's too technical, you shouldn't just have a law because if you don't, you need to have a campaign. And I think one of the things the coalition always tried to do is to say that the pay gap had to be closed by more than just a law, and that it was supposed to also be embedded in collective bargaining. And also in a minimum wage. The minimum wage had always from the very beginning been a key feature to how at least there would be what we used to refer to as a pay equity down payment for women who were in lower paying jobs. That if you kept raising the minimum wage and to see it as a pay equity down payment, that was one of the ways that you could deal with the thing. At the time, another issue was, and I recall that there was critiques that, and I remember there was one thing called just give us the money. In other words, we shouldn't focus on this kind of technical job evaluation analysis of trying to do it, but we should demand the money. And I had, and this is, I'd love to hear some more discussion about what people think about this. I had never been able to get the money by just demanding it, but you see, you've got yours by demanding it. So we keep demanding, and of course you need to keep a struggle, and in all of these things you need to be able to show that you are powerful enough that somebody is prepared to actually proceed with the law. In other words, they don't do it just for the hell of it, so to speak. In any event, we then proceeded through a phase in which the other problem is that the law left out what we used to call 1 million women denied. In other words, the law only allowed for comparisons where you could find an actual male comparator, and for many women in workplaces were excluded from that, which were the campaign we called 1 Million Denied. So we actually got a section in the law which said that you had to have a study in order to actually rectify that problem. And so by the early 90s, we got 2 more methods of evaluating, which added in technically the million. However, as we went along, we then got the Tories, and the Tories took away one of the provisions, which led to pay equity for women in predominantly female workplaces that didn't have a comparator. And this gets us to another thing, I think, which was important in the campaign, is that we also had and were able to rely upon a variety of experts who were able to, and Pat Armstrong is here, and other people who were able to in fact analyze and address a variety of the ways in which the pay gap had operated unequally to, in addition, provide higher gaps to racialized women, to women with disabilities. And we ended up doing a charter challenge when the Tories took away the law, which was ultimately successful in 1997, and I actually recall this. We actually made it above the fold in the Star and the Globe that day, both of them with the heading. And actually SEIU, who brought the case, the international president, was in the city that day, and he was very impressed that his union had managed to get above the fold in both newspapers. So they struck down the law. We had a very conservative judge, actually. It wouldn't have persuaded me, it wouldn't have surprised me if it had gone in the other direction. But he ended up striking the law down and bringing back, at least striking the repealing law down and bringing it back into force. But as many of you will recall, the 90s were very difficult, and the restructurings of the public sector essentially decimated a lot of what had happened and a variety of the gains that had happened. And one of the lessons, which I think that Carolyn's also been talking about, is that there's movements forward and then movements back, and it's kind of a constant process back and forth where you move a bit and then it goes back, you move a bit and you go back. The thing about the law, though, is that having the law meant we had something to work with. And I remember that in BC there was more of a focus on we don't need the law, we'll get the money. And then when the NDP were about to go out of power, I got called and said, would you help us draft a law? Because they had not had a law. And so they drafted a law, and within, I think it was a week of the Liberals coming into power in BC, the law was repealed. And they still don't have a law, and BC has about the highest gender pay gap in the country. And they had, and in BC they had organized to have some of it embedded in their collective agreement structure in the public sector, but then when the Liberals came into power, they decimated a variety of the collective agreement provisions which had embedded the equal pay for work of equal value provisions in it, and of course the private sector didn't have it at all. One of the things that was unusual about Ontario was that it actually applied to the private sector, which was very unusual. The reality is that the Act ended up being able to be, to the extent to which it could be enforced, it was enforced mostly for unionized women. And because it was very difficult to enforce it if you didn't have somebody to actually assist you in enforcing it. And even if you were unionized, it was an enormous struggle to actually get it enforced in any event. However, there were as people will say to me at various points, they say, there was still a lot of money that was obtained. So for example, we brought a second charter challenge when the government refused to continue funding some public sector adjustments. And as a result of settling that, we settled for up to about $400 million. And that was the second charter challenge. So there were large sums of money involved, and that, I think, brings us to part of the notions of why it's important, which is that there is a sense of redistributive justice to the pay equity notion. And that you literally are moving money from businesses to women. And it's one of the reasons actually why I used to think in the 70s when they were saying to me they wanted affirmative action was they somehow thought it was cheaper to move a few women than actually to pay the vast workforce more money, right? And that was really a challenge that they were not prepared to countenance, that those women would actually be paid more. So let me bring you more up to date, because as we moved through the let me see, so we're now, if we come up into the 2000s and whatever, by about 2008 when we got to the 20th anniversary of the Act, we had also started to, while we've talked more generally before about the pay gap, we started to talk about it in a broader way and to talk about trying to address it from a multidimensional perspective and not just from a Pay Equity Act perspective. And the Coalition issued a framework for action back in 2008, which called for kind of a multi-stepped way of looking at it that would address employment equity measures, although we were also involved in employment equity stuff in the early 90s, but employment equity that would talk about childcare, would talk about a whole series of things which actually affected the ability of women to earn money. And it's fair to say that for those periods of time from about 2008 onwards, we were generally ignored, I would say. And we would be involved in election campaigns, we did a variety of things, but in essence, we would get things from the government saying, oh, we have the most progressive Pay Equity Act in the world, so you don't need to do anything more. And so we kept lobbying and talking and whatever, and people as well kept enforcing the Act in terms of maintaining pay equity. But it really wasn't until this particular government was elected that we actually managed to break through again. And so finally, we started to say that we wanted an equal pay day, which sounds somewhat innocuous as I say it here. I feel like it's slightly pathetic, but anyway. So So the first year we declared it ourselves because the government didn't really respond. And last year, although the government didn't respond except they wore red, which is what we asked them to do when they came into the house. So the Premier actually wore red, and then I basically chased her down the hall. And her aide kept trying to move more quickly than me, so we... and I finally grasped her, and I said to her, because we were about to hold a press conference, and I said, okay, you know what, I need you to declare equal pay day, and I also would like you to develop a plan to close the gap. And she said, well, I've got red on. I said, I know you got red on, and that's good to go, but I need more than that. And so she said, well, I'll meet with you. So I said, okay, all right. So I went to the press conference and she said she'd meet with me. So we met with her in July. This would be about a year and a half ago. And the first question she asked, and she was meeting with the whole coalition, was, have you considered how the pay gap impacts racialized workers, racialized women? And I said, gee, Mr. McGinty never asked me that, right? Like that. I said, yes, actually we have, and so I gave her a variety of the stats. I said, but nobody's ever really interested when we discuss that intersectional analysis. That was her first question. In any event, so we talked about it, and she seemed to have some understanding, unlike prior administrations, of what gender equality actually, at least the concept, and what gender analysis was. And so we continued to kind of, I can't remember whether we had, oh yeah, there was another election campaign. Anyways, they finally recognized Equal Pay Day last year, and then we had an immediate election, and in the election, she committed to developing a plan to close the gap, which was what we were trying to get them to do, to say that this gap is not closing. And we had also started to have a frame of the gap is the entire average annual earnings of men and women. And that we take, which is 31%, because that gives you the amount at the end of the day that women and men have differently in Ontario. And it's produced by a whole series of factors, because of course there's a lot of part-time work, which leads to women having the lower, that gap. Whereas if you use the full-time full year, you lose a lot of that measure of various of those factors. In any event, so we now have, in the fall, the Premier mandated the Minister of Labour and the Minister responsible for women's issues to develop a plan to close the pay gap, and actually, unbelievably, to develop a gender lens to be applied to all government policies, programs, and practices. Now, some of you may remember that back in the early 1990s, we actually had one of those that when you went through cabinet, you had to have a gender impact. Now, I should say that although they've said this, we've spent the last 6 months actually trying to figure out what does that mean they're going to do. And because they weren't really moving very fast last week, and Ellie and other people were there, we sent an email to 3,500 people in the Ontario government using InfoGo, and if they had the term director, deputy minister, or policy in their name, or legal counsel, they got an email inviting them to our briefing. So actually 85 of them showed up. We offered lunch. I figured that might help. And we did a tutorial on how to do a gender lens and how to start developing a planning process to close a gap within ministries, and how you would talk about trying to sort out in any project that you have what could be done to help, increase women's earnings, whether you've done an intersectional analysis about who you were serving and whether there was differential earnings with respect to that and differential opportunities. And and Equal Pay Day is April 20th. So that's where we're at the moment. We have swag back there. And we've been trying to widen the process and to have a broader analysis of it, and I'd welcome the opportunity to chat further about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.